Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting thing. But before that, let me go ahead and introduce you to our wonderful speaker, Micah Silverman, who is my great friend from Snyk. Hi, Micah.
Hey, great to be here with everybody today. I'm looking forward to the conversation that's taken the internet by storm.
Yeah. So before we start our fireside chat or our conversation around the vulnerability, which is actually taking the whole internet over the storm, we want to know more about you.
Yeah, sure. So I work for Snyk. I work with you, which I'm very happy about, and I'm our director of DevSecOps Acceleration, which doesn't really tell you much about what I do off the bat, but I am working to bring our stranger danger workshops to the world. And this will certainly, Log4Shell will certainly be a topic that we start to integrate into our stranger danger workshops that we do for customers and prospects who are interested in learning about security vulnerabilities.
Thank you so much, Mika. So, while we get into the discussion, I want to know about what this vulnerability is all about, where everyone is just posting videos, content, and talking about it, like how it all started, what it is.
Yeah, so also I should say by way of background that I've been programming in Java since it was released in 1995. So Java's my jam, and this issue, there's a lot of fascinating aspects to it, but kind of, if we look at the timeline, it really started to blow up around last Thursday, and then it traveled into the weekend, and we really started to understand the scope and the nature of the issue. And it's made kind of non-traditional outlets for nerdy topics, like Java security issues like Bloomberg and NPR. It's kind of filtered its way up to those sort of outlets because of how prevalent it is. So I think it's worth saying off the bat that we might categorize this as an incident. It's an exploit. It's a very important one from the perspective of just how widespread it is, but it's different than a breach. A lot of people have been comparing this to the Equifax breach back in 2017, I think it was. This is a little bit different than that, although it's unfolding as we go through it to understand who may have been directly impacted by it. But there is a difference. So it's a security incident. It's a big vulnerability. It's very widespread. The community I'm very proud of has jumped all over it, and we're addressing it very quickly. But it's definitely the biggest sort of ongoing security incident that I've experienced in quite a long time.
I agree with you, Mika, on that. Like this vulnerability, which was released on 10th of December, actually had a CVSS score of 10, which is like the highest score possible. And all current version of Log4j um, up to 2.14.1 are vulnerable, which is like a huge list. And so many organizations are vulnerable to that. Like, so if let's say we talk about the ecosystems, because it affects almost most of the internet, like that's what people say, that's what we are hearing, that's what the stats says. So if let's say I need to fix, and even before fixing I need to find this vulnerability, how I can do that in my environment, because it is becoming tricky for me. I have so many things running in my environment. And even if I go back in time and talk about the Equifax breach, the similar things happen wherein people were trying to figure out whether I'm using Apache or not. And now we're talking about whether we are using this logging framework or not. So how exactly I can find it before even if I talk about fixing it. So how do I do
Yeah,
that?
yeah, it's a great question, and I want to jump into it. But one thing, a lot of people like to kind of understand what they can do right away. What can I do right away? So before I jump into that, I just want to say that using the latest version of Java with whatever version you're using is a big help right off the bat. So if you're using JDK 8, no problem. Just make sure you're using the latest version of it. Because what we find is that it's particularly, there's a particular seriousness to the exposure if you're using older versions of Java. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. We can talk about that. But that's like the quickest fix there is. If you're using Java 8, we're not saying you must upgrade to Java 11, but just make sure that you're using the latest version of the Java 8 JDK or whatever Java version you're using. And then kind of getting into the question, it's, are you using Log4j and what version of Log4j are you using? Couple of things to talk about that. If you're using Spring Boot, for instance, Spring Boot doesn't use Log4j, it uses Logback. So good news there, you kind of dodged a bullet. So if you're using Spring Boot, you can breathe a deep sigh of relief, and that's, Spring Boot is very well proliferated in the industry. But let's assume for the moment that you're not. So then what? Well, you want to look for dependencies and transitive dependencies, which can get a little gnarly. So like the first level is to look at your dependencies. If you're using Maven or Gradle, that's something you could even eyeball. Look in your POM file and see if you're referencing Log4j. That's pretty straightforward. That's like the first level. You can also use a tool like Snyk, Snyk test, and it will tell you like right off the bat if you have a vulnerability, even with transitive dependencies. And in case you're not familiar with that, that just means the dependencies of other dependencies. So maybe I'm using a popular open source library, and unbeknownst to me, that library depends on Log4j. Well, just looking at my POM file or my build.gradle file, I may not know that. But if you use a tool like Snyk, it will dig into those transitive dependencies and let you know what that looks like. And it might be useful. I'll share my screen here for a sec, just to get a view of what that looks like. Bear with me 1 second as I figure out which screen I actually want to share. All right, I think I got it right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
And
what happens when we have multiple screens.
right. And so if hopefully I'm showing the right screen here. What the output that I'm showing here, this is a Log4Shell proof of concept project that we'll probably talk about a little later. But here is the point. We get this really nice output that shows that we have this issue. There's a dependency that's at the wrong version, and it shows us right off the bat how to remedy it. So simply by upgrading to one of these versions that's called out, upgrading or downgrading, depending on the case, that will resolve the problem. And, one thing that I think is useful to talk about that we'll get more into is this is an evolving situation. So for the most part, the community has been really great and really on top of things. And, Apache released a patch almost immediately. Then they released another version to go a step further because additional issues were found. And I've seen, it's definitely in the minority, but I've seen some complaints out there on Twitter, like, oh, we got this patch and now we got another one right away. And we're all kind of reacting to this. But it's kind of the nature of how this goes, where we want to address the problem as quickly and as safely as we can. So the first patch release from Apache went most of the way to resolving the issue. And then it was discovered, well, now we've introduced or there still exists this denial of service issue. It's a much less serious issue than the original one, which is a remote code execution. We can talk about the nature of those issues too, but it's still a serious issue. And so they released a new patch. And we should probably expect that it's going to be that way for a little while. Maybe there'll be a handful of more releases before we kind of settle into like we've really addressed the full breadth of the problem. And maybe not. Maybe maybe with 2.16 we really got everything now. But I think it's a good moment to say, like, let's have some patience around this. We're talking about, we're what, 3 or 4 days, 4 or 5 days since, it really started to blow up, and we've already reacted really well to it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, and especially when so much chaos is going around with it. And rightly mentioned that let's use the updated version. That's one solution for sure. But then there is a point that comes into picture is what can we do, especially from a software perspective, when most of our softwares are using this version. And when Log4j is extensively used across vendors, open source projects, frameworks, and even top level foundation projects, in addition to millions of Java applications which are using Log4j. Many of the Apache Software Foundation's own projects are making use of Log4j themselves. So uh, think about all of these things, how exactly people can contribute to these remediations. People can help around um, getting this information, right information to the people, because everyone is so much scared. They're having sleepless nights. They're making sure that the incident team is working on this vulnerability across the hours. So now it's not just DevSecOps, it's not just the open source component, or especially this logging framework, but everyone from the organization is being involved. Developers, security team, application security team, and the people who are working in the background, making sure that there's nothing which is going wrong. So, in all these chaos, how can one calm down and then take us baby steps to make sure that they are not breached, they are uh, they're taking the right steps?
Yeah, I think you made a bunch of excellent points in there, and the question is really well taken. And this is one of those examples of different elements of these teams coming together in a way that's really useful. And we've seen a lot of focus, and I have a lot of focus as a developer on the core nature of the issue and how to fix it. So upgrade Log4j. But there's so much more to it, where if you didn't touch Log4j, or maybe you're not entirely sure if you're affected, if you have a good security team that you can have a conversation with and make sure that, like, the nature of the problem, let's take a step back. The nature of the problem is that a call is made to an external domain that potentially could be malicious, that returns a malicious serialized Java object. We can get into all that in a little bit. But the core nature is that an outbound call is made to an external domain. Well, if you have a network security team and you can be assured that in your production environment, you're not allowing outbound calls to random domains, or if that's not the case, that you have a security team you can work with who can shut that down right away, then that gives you a little bit of breathing room to investigate, do you even have this problem? But the problem goes away if your production server can't make outbound LDAP and HTTP calls to random, servers potentially. The problem goes away, even if you have this older version of Log4j. So it's a really good example of where you can go up and down the stack and engage these other teams to look at remediation. And it might be a good time to kind of pause and look at your network policies. If you're in a containerized kind of environment, look at your Docker files, or look at your Kubernetes configuration, and do you have a healthy network configuration such that even if you are using this older version of Log4j or an older JDK, that you wouldn't be subject to this issue because everything gets cut off at the network. So maybe a request is attempted, but that fails because of your network policies that don't allow that outbound request.
Yeah, you made a very valid point, especially about the outbound connections. Now, um, while we are talking about that, if let's say I am vulnerable and I know about it, I'm trying to fix it, but then there is something which is happening in the background. How exactly I can detect it? Are there any tools? Are there any mechanisms? Especially if I talk from a vendor neutral perspective. Let's say for a small company, they don't have any resource to scan. So, from an open source perspective, what are the things that I can do to make sure that I know that yes, my I can detect it and maintain it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there are some great tools that have emerged just over the weekend. I mean, the way that the community has come together has been really astounding. And there are already tools like there's a Log4Shell detection kit that I haven't personally played with just yet, but I believe it does things like test for outbound network connections and look at what it can do. And, that might be a quick thing to look at, a quick tool to use to look at. Um, there's also the funny thing about Log4j and other Java loggers is that you can kick up the 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 log level of your application, and you can start looking at things like outbound network traffic. Now, that may generate a ton of logs, but it's the kind of thing where you might not even need an application restart. So maybe you kick the log level way up and you spend an hour monitoring the logs and seeing if there's any unexplained or unexpected outbound network connection. So you can kind of, even though the problem exists in Log4j, you can use Log4j to help you discover if you're dealing or if you're subject to the problem or if somebody's, trying to make these outbound connections. Um, it's also, a good time to take a look at things like network policies and things like kind of low hanging fruit. Like this is the exploitation of this particular issue is not too dissimilar from a cross-site scripting attack, where you have unvalidated or unfiltered um, strings that, in this case, are making their way out to a log file. So that's something that might be a useful thing just to review in your code. And again, not to kind of shamelessly plug Snyk all over the place, but Snyk code can help with that, as it will catch cross-site script or unvalidated inputs. So if you have an input that you're sending directly to a log, unfiltered or unvalidated, that could lead to a malicious actor trying to get a specific string into your log files that triggers this whole Log4Shell issue. So, like, one of the things you brought up was small companies or teams with limited resources. I would say that the lowest hanging fruit is that outbound network connection. Shut that down, and then you can take the time to look and see transitive dependencies, and if you're using Log4j and where you might have that issue. It gives you a little bit of breathing room.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when this chaos is there, we need the breathing room. Now, there is a question by Kyle that what are some of the most popular pieces of software using Log4j?
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of why we're having these live streams and part of what we're doing here, like, we don't want to generate an unnecessary level of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But the short answer to the question is almost too many to name. Log4j is so popular and it's so ubiquitous in a way. It's like saying Band-Aid. It's used in a lot of places. Um, a specific piece of software doesn't pop to mind that's using it, because I kind of dwell in the world of Spring Boot a lot. But it's we were discussing a little before the live stream, like, it cuts across industries. you can pretty much be guaranteed that there's Java applications in banking and in healthcare and airlines. Like, you name an industry, it's almost certain if they have a Java application, it's likely that they have Log4j somewhere in the stack. Now, again, that's not to generate fear around this. It's just to say that it's very out there. It's why it's a level 10 vulnerability. It's why a lot of us lost sleep over the weekend and are continuing to, because it's kind of that level of severity. Fortunately, the remediation, how to address it, is fairly straightforward. Look at your outbound network, look at your version of Java, look at your version of Log4j. That's kind of it. And once you've done that, it kind of plugs up the hole fairly quickly. So the good news, sometimes we have a very serious vulnerability that's not easily addressed. This one happens to be fairly easily addressed. And you do need to cross that kind of threshold of, am I affected by this? That maybe is not as easy to answer as we would prefer, but we have a lot of tools out there now that make answering that question a lot easier. If you're familiar with Maven, there's a great Maven command that gives you a dependency tree, including transitive dependencies, and you can see right away, if you're familiar with the command line and you're familiar with Maven, you're also probably familiar with grep. So you can search your dependency tree, grep for log4j, and very quickly, in seconds, just see what versions are floating around in your stack, even in transitive dependencies. So just as an example, that's a way you can kind of dig into this.
Yeah. And you brought a very important point of transitive dependencies, because that sometimes becomes so much of problematic for an organization, because they don't even get to know that how exactly they're interlinked, they're connected, and what are the things which are flowing in the network. Now, um, while we talk about these transitive dependencies, there is another point is that uh, people are using a lot of security products because they want to get secure. But do you feel that security products themselves are vulnerable? Like, um, do you think that any chance that these products can be vulnerable and making our environment vulnerable?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one honestly that I hadn't really thought of. The question, I guess, is the security tool Java? That's a good place to start. If it is Java, is it using Log4j? And if it's not easily knowable, it's something that you can definitely ask the company. And I've seen a lot of companies have already made statements. I saw Snyks, I saw some other companies that have already made statements about their own stacks, not necessarily security tools per se, but they've reassured their customers that either they had the vulnerability and they fixed it, or they don't have it, or they're currently looking into it, but not to worry. So it's good to know. And the good thing is that a lot of the tools that we do use are open source, and so this is all knowable. We can know if it's a Java based tool. We can know, in a lot of cases, we can look at that dependency tree ourselves and kind of see what's going on there.
Right, absolutely. Even I could figure out that there is a huge list of softwares and information which is being circulated around. So, did we create any amazing list around this? Like an awesome list around Log4Shell where people can actually look at it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I totally forgot about it, and I have it. I even have it ready to show. But yeah, we definitely do. Let's see. I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully, I've done it right. And yeah, so we have this on Snyk Labs. We have this awesome Log4Shell, and this is a really great resource because it starts with explanation. Maybe you're just becoming aware of this and you don't even know exactly what's going on. It's got a bunch of videos. It's got a list of vulnerable software, and some of the some of the links here are to other people's lists that are continuing to evolve and grow. It's also got a section on detection and remediation, um, uh, and we just added this section on proofs of concept. If it's important to you as a developer to really deeply understand what's going on or to see it in action, you can actually run this on your local machine and see this mechanism in action. But this is something that we're continuing to expand on and work on. If we look at, yeah, we have 30 pull requests since we started, and this was within the last day. We've added to this 30 times, so we're going to continue to do that. We welcome contributions. We have a little link here to contributing, so I definitely want to
Mhm.
encourage people to make pull requests and to expand this list. It will continue to expand in its awesomeness if we all do that.
Absolutely. I think people, can you share the screen again? Because there was some,
Oh
I
yeah,
think,
absolutely.
issue with the screen rendering. There was
Oh yeah.
the overlay was not right.
Yeah, no problem. And I'll make sure to post the link in the chat as well. It's fairly straightforward. It's Snyk Lab / awesome - log for shell. And I'll put that in the chat as well. But I can leave this up while we continue to talk if it'll be useful.
Yeah,
Is the
absolutely.
overlay happening?
Um,
There we go.
yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So now, while we are talking about it, and especially awesome list, there's another thing that comes into my mind is OWASP top 10. Because OWASP, which is Open Web Application Security Project, talks about all the application security risks, bugs, issues, and whatnot. Uh, oh, okay. Someone says that they spoke too soon. I think there's still some overlay issue there.
Okay. Well, let me just put it into the comments. Can I do that? You know what? I'm going to private chat it to you and you can put it in the comments just so we have the link
Ab-
out there.
Ready? Absolutely. Let me go ahead and put it in the comment section. And I'm going to just show it.
There we go.
Perfect. Now, um, now coming back to the question around OWASP top 10, and that's not a question to you, but to everyone. So while we talk about OWASP top 10, uh, the injection flaw that was on top of the list, like number one for a lot of years. And this year, when the new top 10 got released in September, it actually moved down to, to three, like number three. So jumping to number three was a big deal because I remember uh, getting into conversations around Twitter and LinkedIn where people were talking about it like injection has been there for years and it is going to be there when our kids are going to grow up. And while it is happening, um, we are seeing that it is stepping down. So, do you think that it's going to come up on top of the list, or do you think that people are going to see the importance of injection flaws, or which is actually creating a lot of chaos? So, what's your inputs on that?
Yeah, well, it is very interesting to me. I posted the link to the OWASP injection page. And the first item on that page speaks to allowing an attacker to execute operating system calls on a target machine. And that's kind of exactly what's happening here in the worst case with Log4Shell. So, from a security perspective, like top three is still pretty serious, right? But you know, I'd like to turn the question around and ask, well, what's displaced it? What are the top two now? And it'll be interesting to me to see if this has an impact. I don't fully understand the process just yet of how these things move around in the OWASP list, but if it's by popularity or if it's by recent security events, then I would imagine in the next couple of years this might move up again just because of what we're experiencing right now with Log4Shell. But I imagine it's along a complex dimension of criteria, and maybe recent breaches is only one of them. I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. Especially when we talk about uh, the impact that it is creating. A lot of organizations have posted that they are affected and they're trying to fix it. And at the same time, there are organizations who have no clue about it, whether they are affected or not. So their status is still unknown. And then there are some people who specifically calls it out that yes, we are not affected. But um, there are points wherein these injection flaws, these flaws actually make a lot of difference, wherein this leads to the security incidents. And do we still know that I remember having a conversation with you backstage where you were talking about something specific when the Equifax breach happened. So do you want to talk about it right now? Wherein there was a specific version which was actually not updated at that time. So do we feel that Log4Shell has been there since then, or even we can talk about it like it's a vulnerability which has been existing in the wild?
Yeah, this part of the conversation is fascinating to me because it is something that like history repeats itself with security vulnerabilities. So what's interesting to me about this is that the two of the three primary components that make up Log4Shell were called out in a black hat presentation in 2016. So Jindy and LDAP, right? If you're not familiar with exactly those terms, don't worry. It's part of what makes up Log4Shell. But those two of the three components were called out at this Black Hat conference. And then in 2017, we have this request that Jindy be added to Log4j, the ability to make these network directory calls. And there was a use case presented, and it was accepted. Now, the fascinating thing to me is that this has kind of sat there now since 2017. This capability for Log4Shell has been there since 2017. And in fact, it was probably even more of an issue back then because in order to fully use the exploit, you need an older version of the JDK. Well, back then, that was probably the newest version of the JDK that would have allowed this exploit. So the question, which I don't have a satisfying answer for, is hindsight is 2020, right? This has been sitting there since 2017. Why didn't we catch it sooner? Why did it blow up over this past weekend, 4 years, maybe nearly 5 years later, when it's been sitting here kind of dormant this whole time? And it does beg the question, well, among the takeaways from this are, what can we do to catch things earlier in the future before it ever blows up like it's blown up? Maybe in 2017, somebody would have said, "Hey, this is a great idea that you want to add Jindy to Log4j, but you know." We just heard at Black Hat that Jindy and LDAP are problematic. Maybe it's not really important that we add the capability for outbound network calls to a logging framework like Log4j. And in fact, in the latest patch that Apache's released, they've completely removed the Jindy capability from Log4j. So that's kind of the most extreme reaction that we could have. But I think it's an acknowledgement that it's such an edge case of a use case that maybe it kind of shouldn't have been there in the first place for something like a logger. Again, Like, I'm not trying to, I didn't know about this any more than anybody else did. So it's all wisdom of being able to look back. So how do we catch the next one? Because there will be a next one. Equifax. I don't know the exact stats as well as I do for Log4Shell, but the vulnerability was sitting there for a while before it was exploited and discovered, or discovered and exploited, depending on which way you're looking at.
Right. Yeah, there's a very interesting point that Laurent makes, that Equifax incidents was also due to the Apache project, because it was an open source project. The patch was available, but then it took some time to update, and we know what's the history. So it is not just one organization which is impacted. It is not just one organization uh, that has this issue, or that had the Apache issue. Yeah, but the point comes is that we start talking about it when the breach happens, when something big happens. Now we need to make sure that we maintain a list of things what we have, because it all starts with our own house. What if we don't know what we have in our house? We would never be able to secure it. And there is something very interesting what people say, that it's not my child. Oh, it doesn't happen. It is not going to happen to me. But you never know when it becomes your child and it becomes your problem. Because if that can happen to them, it can happen to us as well. And these breaches, these issues are inevitable. If someone says that we are 100% secure, trust me, there is some loop which is going on, and there's someone who's living in the fancy world. Because when we are on the internet, we by default are breached, because our data is on the internet. Anyone can scrub it. It's just that how do we make sure that we mask it, we secure it. And on top of it, when these vulnerabilities come and we start talking about them on these conversations, on these live chats, and the best part is that people start coming on and share their inputs. It shows us that we are all connected within the community, but we need to still make sure that we have our environments up to date. Now, I have seen a lot of vendors, or I would say most of the vendors, they're talking about it. Oh, we are trying to take steps to fix these bugs. Oh, we are not vulnerable. Oh, we are trying to figure out whether we are vulnerable or not. So I've seen the enterprises, like the huge enterprises, which are talking about that we are still trying to scrub our organization and trying to get to know whether where do we stand. So that's very, very interesting. And again, this is mm, across the internet, across the vendors, and across the whole geography, and everyone is impacted by it. So while we talk about it, there's another point comes to you, Mika, that we as individuals, what are the things we should keep in mind while we are trying to mitigate? And another thing on the same lines, like I'm going to ask these two questions because these two questions are coming up simultaneously. That WAF, web application firewall, which act as more of a proactive control that we do you think that's sufficient to to maintain or to secure our environments from these attacks?
Yeah, so there are two parts to the question, and you mentioned something really important, I think, as you were speaking earlier, which is we're in the exploit right now. We're talking about the exploit, and what I like to point out is that that is the middle of the timeline. So there's something that happened prior to the exploit, and in this case, it goes back to we could say it goes back to 2016. That's a pretty long, early part of the timeline. But we're in the middle of it now. And now the question is, how quickly are companies going to discover if they're at risk and patch that risk? And will it be a situation where 6 months from now, we're going to find out about, some big important company with a lot of data who didn't upgrade their version of JDK or didn't upgrade their version of Log4j, and now are caught out. Hopefully, we hope that history won't repeat itself in this case. And there are so many tools out there now to mitigate the risks. That it doesn't have to be that way. So one thing to keep in mind is that we're in the middle of the timeline right now. We're not at the beginning and we're not at the end. And then with specific questions like WAF, that is kind of, as a knee-jerk reaction, it's a great idea, but it's also something that's not so simple. So if you're in a situation where you do need some level of outbound network capabilities for your application, then you're in a more complex situation. And what we've seen is that I'm going to share my screen again, and hopefully there won't be overlap, but I'll make sure to give a link to this also. But Simon at Snyk produced a wonderful remediation cheat sheet. And there's a whole section here on WAF. It's one of the bigger sections, actually. And it's basically saying that it should be kind of a last resort to stop attacks, because it has this whole nice list here of tricky interpolation strings that pass through WAF rules, because we're looking specifically for Jindy :LDAP, but then you have all of these valid strings that will happily be resolved to Jindy LDAP, but won't specifically get caught by your WAF rules. And this is a list of payloads which have bypassed rules already. So it's important to look at, but it should be, the idea I said earlier of giving yourself some breathing room, that's very applicable if you know for sure that your application has no good reason to be making outbound network requests on its own. But if it does, it's more complex, and you have to in all cases, I would say, you need to do the real remediation, which is what we're looking at in 1 and 2 on the cheat sheet here. But you can get some early kind of breathing room or benefit from looking at your outbound network connections. But longer term, you can't rely on that alone.
Yeah, Mika, can you share your screen again and let's zoom it a bit because a lot of people want to see it more closely.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah. Let me do that again. I can use tools. All right, here we go. So let me zoom this in a bit. Here we go. And I can even zoom further with my little zoomy tool here, but hopefully this is big enough. And I'll make sure to put the link to this in the stream as well. But
Great.
this is
Yeah.
this is this is by the way, this is linked to from the awesome Log4Shell repo that we had up earlier, and it's a really handy reference to, like I mentioned earlier, the Maven dependency tree. That's part of it here. Making sure that you upgrade to the latest version. Even this cheat sheet has gone through a couple of iterations internally, because of the fact that we went from Log4j 2.15 to 2.16 very quickly, as the scope of the issue was emerging. And at this point, 2.16 really is your safest bet, because even if you don't have, say, network rules that block outbound traffic, even if you're using an older version of a JDK, 2.16 literally removes the capability from Log4j to do Jindy lookups at all. And so that is really the best way to ensure that you're not going to be exploitable with this particular Log4Shell issue.
Yeah, that's totally amazing. And um, especially this Log4Shell remediation cheat sheet. Let me just go ahead and show it on the screen again, like the link, if anyone wants to go ahead and take a look at it. Because these cheat sheets really help. Like I've been a huge fan of cheat sheets wherein that's one stop place where I can look at, oh, what are the things that I can do, take notes from. So everyone, this cheat sheet is amazing. Do look out for it, and any inputs, anything that you want to share, make sure you fork the repository around awesome list and share your inputs. And we would be happy to accept your pull request. Now, there's so many discussions which have happened around Log4Shell, Log4j, and OWASP top 10 or injection flaws. Minka, do you think that um, we've missed anything around this particular vulnerability, or are we coming up with something new around this vulnerability, like a DevSecOps community, which we're going to be talking about, or any space that we can host where people can come in and chime in?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that it's continuing to evolve, and there may be additional patches, there may be additional information. So it's really good to get plugged into a community if you're not already. We already have a channel on the DevSecCon community, specifically for Log4Shell. For anybody that's tuned in right now, I'd welcome additional posts in the comments of links to other communities or other active resources where people can go to kind of stay tuned to what's happening as it happens.
Right. Thank you so much. That is really, really helpful. Now, to summarize for everyone, make sure that you look at this vulnerability, which is remote code execution vulnerability in Apache Log4j software library. Now, there are many versions which are vulnerable, but especially look at the older versions from version 2.0 to beta 9 to 2.14.1, which is known as Log4Shell and Logjam. Now, this is broadly used in variety of products which we are using. Even I've heard that Android versions, which are like Android TVs that we are using, that's vulnerable. That was very concerning for me. But then what we can do is make sure that we keep our softwares up to date and get to know what we are using. Now, there are a lot of technical details which Mika talked about, and there are a lot of resources which are available on the internet, and even awesome list that we are preparing is going to help everyone around all the details that we have. And that's not just about what the vulnerability is, what are the mitigation, how you can check it, but yes, it also talks about the great conversation that people are having on Twitter, LinkedIn, or any other space, so that you can chime in. You can chime in in all those conversations. So do feel free to plug in that and reach out to me or Mika for any inputs, any conversations. Now, while I was wrapping it up, there is interesting question by Matt here. Uh, so it's on the screen, Makeup. Do we know what the original use case was for having Gendi support in Log4j?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I posted a link to that original request from 2017. And I have it up here on my screen. And first, I want to say, like, no shade to anybody that made the request, that integrated the request into Log4j. This is how open source works. There was a request for a feature, a PR was made, some conversation happened, and it was approved. So always in hindsight, we can say, well, this wasn't a good idea, but there was a specific use case here, and it was, and I must admit, I don't fully understand it, but it was all about being able to dynamically include different web application contexts in the log file. So using this routing appender to put all the logs from a similar web application in a particular log file based on where it was coming from. So Jindy is all about looking up information from a directory. So it would be handy to be able to look up from a directory and find out a source for where to write a log file, for instance. Um, and we can actually, this is like really getting into the weeds here, but we can look at the patch here, and we can see that this Jindy lookup class is among the things that was added to Log4j at this point. Now, for a logger, we might easily say from the lens of 2021, like maybe this isn't such a great idea. We don't maybe want our logger automatically doing lookups. And in fact, this is precisely what's now been removed from the stack. But the open source can be a double-edged sword. We get these rapid additions and feature requests, and features are added a lot quicker than maybe a traditional private source company would be able to do so. But every now and then we run into this sort of issue where it seemed like a good idea at the time. There was a valid use case for it, but it leads to what we're now dealing with. Fortunately, in this case, the remedy is fairly straightforward because, as it turns out, maybe it's not so important to do directory lookup straight from the logger.
Yep, absolutely agree with you. Thank you so much, Mika, for the wonderful conversation, and not to miss our wonderful audience, which actually kept the whole conversation alive. For anyone, um, please go ahead and check out the wonderful Log4Shell remediation cheat sheet and the awesome list. And do feel free to share your feedback, your inputs, or maybe if you want to strike a conversation, do feel free to post your questions to us on LinkedIn or on Twitter. We'll be happy to have a conversation. And make sure you follow us and subscribe the Snyk Live so that you can actually tune into the future live streams. There are so many which are coming up, and tomorrow also we have a wonderful live stream around Log4Shell. So do check out those conversations. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about what has the Log4Shell vulnerability taught us about application security, which is a very, very important topic. And tune in to us around 1:30 p.m. UTC. All right.
All
So give
right.
me
Thanks a
one
lot,
second. Let
Vandana.
me thank you so much, Mika, for joining me. It was amazing to have conversation with you, and you're always, always amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Back at you.